Hello and welcome to a quick discussion of Chapter 18 of Crow Country by Kate Constable. This chapter is a continuation from the time slip episode that Sadie falls into in the previous chapter, and by the end of this one she's out of that time slip period and back to reality. This chapter, however, focuses not on Jimmy but on Mr. Mortlock and his side of the story, and of course Sadie and Clary's reaction to that. Alright, let's have a look at some of the quotes and see what's important here. So as Sadie's travelling back to Mr. Mortlock and leaving Clary to deal with Jimmy's body, we get this description here. The tears that had refused to fall when she sat beside Jimmy's body were spilling freely now, but they were tears of rage, of disbelief. So it's not as though she's upset by what's happened in the way that you would normally expect her to respond, and it shows a lot about her character, how she is angered by Mr. Mortlock's actions here, in the fact that she's caused the death of, essentially, one of her friends. So she's grief-stricken. And this line from Clary is quite surprising and concerning at the same time. "I'll give him a Christian burial," Dad said. "I'll pray for his soul. He was a good man. Jimmy, he deserves that much." Now, while Clary's trying to be respectful here, he's doing the complete opposite. Instead of organising a traditional Aboriginal burial and treating his friend with the dignity that he deserves, Clary is trying to do the only thing that he can to show some respect without causing any further consequences or ramifications for himself and of course for Mr. Mortlock. So he does what he considers to be the right thing in giving him that Christian burial. But as an audience, we probably see differently. And here we get Sadie's reaction. Sadie's jaw clenched. Jimmy had bled to death like any man. Why would the colour of his skin make him different inside? And this is one of those really important lessons that we truly are superficial when we judge people based solely on the colour of their skin. And someone in Sadie's position, who is essentially a child, is able to make that distinction, yet the rest of humanity cannot. So while she may be naive, she's got a much better view of other people than those who are affected by the racism of this era. And this is probably because of the experiences of her father, and he's been such a good role model in displaying how she should behave around members of the Aboriginal community and show them adequate respect. But this really powerful dialogue between Sadie and her father demonstrates how the conflict here is actually bigger than just what's in front of them. There is a lot of politics going on in the background that has led to Clary making this decision. I'll read the quote. "It's not right, Dad. You know it. I have to help Gerald. I promise I'd look out for him." "And what about Jimmy? Didn't you promise him too?" Her voice rose shrill, hysterical. "Jimmy was murdered. Gerald Mortlock should hang for this." Dad slapped her face. "Oh," Sadie sprang back, her hand to her cheek. Dad released her at once. They stood a few feet apart, breathing hard beneath the moon. "I owe Gerald Mortlock money," said Dad. "A lot of money." Sadie pressed her hand to her face. She said nothing. "If anything happens to him, we're finished. Do you understand? I'll lose the shop, everything. You and your mum, the kids, we're all out on the street." So what we've got revealed here, and it's a very tense part of the text, and it sort of shows when Clary slaps Sadie, it shows just how much they're struggling with what they're facing. But it also shows the motivations for his actions beyond just trying to do the right thing. So it's a very surprising exchange, and it's good to see Sadie being so strong and standing up for what is right and what is just, even in this instance, standing up and arguing with her father. Shows a real strength of her character there. But then, of course, when we look at Clary's motivation, for the financial security of the family, we can see how selfish this act is, and he's displaying here some very questionable values. But at the same time, we can completely understand them. He's in a little bit of a dilemma here, and he's looking out for his family, simply because, I suppose, there's not really a lot he can do for Jimmy now that Jimmy has passed away. And then this quote here, this excellent description, tries to capture, I think, how Sadie feels at this point. The stars peered down at her like hundreds of eyes in another world laid above this one. It's almost as if Sadie feels like she's being judged by the heavens, and the guilt is affecting her in that way. And then, of course, when Sadie's back at home in the shop, trying to deal with Mr. Mortlock, and has to go into the house to go and get a few things, and has to talk to her mum and essentially try and lie to her here. And the dialogue here shows how respected Sadie is, even in this family unit. I can't tell you, Mum. There are things Dad wants me to do. Seeing Mum's pale face, Sadie felt as if she were the adult and Mum were the child. And what's interesting about this is that that's really how Sadie feels in some instances in terms of her relationship with Ellie. And so there is a pattern of behaviour here that travels through the different generations. Let's continue. As the dialogue unfolds and we hear more of Mr. Mortlock's version of events, and they're trying to essentially work out the best way to solve this whole situation, we get this passage here. She shook with wordless anger, with disgust, as she wrung out the cloth and sponged Mr. Mortlock's hands, his murdering hands smeared with dried blood. This is some pretty horrible imagery here, and it's symbolic of, washing yourself of the blame, removing the guilt, and trying to cleanse yourself of your actions. And it clearly makes Sadie uncomfortable because she's doing it with disgust. She's unable to speak, and she's shaking as though her body's reacting to it. So again, capturing her character quite well. And as we get more information from Mr. Mortlock, he continues to talk through. He says some things that I think the audience would on occasion disagree with, and this is one of those elements that sort of sparks a little bit of discomfort in his justification. And this line where he says, got some funny notion in his head, the way they do. And he's generalising about people of the Aboriginal community and how essentially they have beliefs that differ from his, and therefore they must be wrong because they are not his beliefs. And so it's showing how there's obviously very poor understanding, very poor communication between the two cultures here, the Aboriginal and the non-Aboriginal cultures. And he continues, Mr. Mortlock continues here. Had to defend myself, didn't I? Said Mr. Mortlock abruptly. Anyone could see that. He was like a bloody madman. He paced up and down the shop, flicking ash on the floor. The gun went off while we were struggling. That's what happened. It was an accident. He glanced sharply at Sadie. That's what happened, he repeated. Now, you can see here that in terms of the structure of his sentences, it's very short and very sharp. He's very uncertain of himself. it's as though he's trying to convince himself. So the more he verbalizes his story, he's trying to convince himself more than he's trying to convince Sadie. And Sadie doesn't fall for it. She's very clever and she picks up on what he's saying and the contradiction in his own words. And Sadie herself says, either it was an accident or you were defending yourself. It can't be both. So she's starting to doubt the validity of Mr. Mortlock's version of events. And quite rightly so. Again, a very brave thing for a girl in her situation to do. The very last quote I'd like to draw to your attention is this one. And this is again about the strength of Sadie's character. No, Sadie wanted to cry. Not there. She felt like weeping. She knew Dad meant it as a sign of respect. The only sign he felt he could give. But it seemed all wrong. Jimmy should have been buried near the stones, under the trees, in the heart of the bush. He wouldn't have wanted to lie with the Mortlocks. So, even at her young age, it's as though Sadie has a pretty strong understanding of the link to sacred places and the importance of sustaining those connections, even in this instance, in Jimmy's death. But of course, Clary was not put into a position where he's able to make that decision, and he's certainly not put into a position where he's able to bury Jimmy wherever he pleases. This is a case of covering up a murder. And of course we end the chapter with Sadie waking out of her dreamlike state and coming back to reality, and Mrs. Fox asking her if she is pregnant, which of course we know she is not. But this has been an ETV production brought to you by Prendeville Catholic College.